My stepmom asked me to do this. While my dad was out, it was well past office hours, and the building was quiet, almost eerie in its stillness. The soft hum of the air conditioner and the distant sound of a cleaning crew provided the only background noise in the otherwise empty office. I sat at my desk, the glow of my computer screen illuminating the scattered papers in front of me. I should have been tired. It had been a long day after all. But my mind was racing with thoughts I didn't dare entertain during regular hours. She was still here. My boss, Isabel. A woman in her early 40s, she exuded the kind of confidence that commanded attention in every room she walked into. Her sharp eyes, framed by dark, wavy hair that fell just past her shoulders, had a way of looking right through you. It wasn't just her beauty that made her stand out. It was the way she carried herself. Decisive, no nonsense, and always in control. She was everything I admired and everything I feared. A soft knock on the door frame broke the silence. I looked up, and there she was, leaning against the door with her arms crossed, her eyes fixed on me in that penetrating way that always made my stomach flutter. "Still here?" she asked, her voice low and smooth. "Yeah, just wrapping up a few things," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. "What about you?" Isabel stepped into the office, her heels clicking softly against the polished floor as she approached my desk. "Same. Too much to do, not enough time," she said with a small smile, one that didn't quite reach her eyes. There was something different about her tonight. She was dressed in her usual tailored suit, but the way she looked at me felt charged. It was subtle, just a lingering glance, a pause that seemed too long, but enough to send my heart racing. For weeks, there had been this unspoken tension between us. It started with the little things. A touch on my arm that lasted just a second too long, the way she'd lean over my desk during meetings, her proximity always a little too close. I had tried to convince myself that it was all in my head, that I was just misreading things. But as the days went on, it became harder to ignore. "You've been doing good work lately," Isabel said, sitting on the edge of my desk, her legs crossing elegantly as she looked down at me. I swallowed, my throat suddenly dry. "Thank you." Her eyes held mine for a moment before drifting to the papers scattered across the desk. "But I've noticed you seem a little distracted lately. Is everything okay?" My pulse quickened. Was she testing me? Did she know? I couldn't tell if her question was innocent or if she was hinting at something more. I forced a smile. "I've just had a lot on my mind, that's all." Isabel reached out, brushing a piece of lint from my sleeve, her fingers grazing my skin lightly. The touch was brief, but it sent a spark through me. "Anything I can help with?" she asked, her voice softer now, more intimate. I hesitated, unsure of how to respond. The air between us felt thick with something unsaid, and I could feel the tension building with every passing second. My thoughts raced, a mix of guilt and desire tangling together. This was wrong. She was my boss, and we were alone in the office after hours. But as much as my mind screamed at me to keep my distance, my body betrayed me, leaning ever so slightly toward her. Isabel seemed to sense the shift. Her hand, still resting on my sleeve, moved up to my shoulder, her fingers tracing a slow, deliberate path. My breath hitched, and I could feel the heat rising in my chest. "Isabel," I started, but she cut me off with a quiet shush. "Don't," she whispered, her eyes locking onto mine. "I know you felt it too." The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. There it was, the thing we had both been avoiding, dancing around for weeks. She leaned in, her face close to mine, and I could feel the warmth of her breath against my skin. My heart pounded in my chest, and every nerve in my body screamed for more, even as my mind told me to stop. "This is wrong," I murmured, though the conviction in my voice was fading fast. "Is it?" she asked softly, her lips just inches from mine. Or is it exactly what we both want? Her words sent a shiver down my spine, and I felt the last of my resolve crumbling. Isabel's hand slid to the back of my neck, pulling me closer. And before I knew it, our lips met in a slow, burning kiss. It was tentative at first, like we were testing the waters, but then it deepened, and all the tension that had been building between us came rushing out. I kissed her back, my hands gripping the edge of the desk as if to steady myself. Isabel's hands were on me now, roaming over my shoulders, pulling me closer to her. The kiss was intoxicating, overwhelming in its intensity, and I found myself lost in it, in her. For a moment, nothing else mattered. Not the office, not the fact that this was my boss, not the consequences. It was just us, caught in a moment we couldn't, or didn't want to, escape. Her hand slid under my shirt, her touch searing against my skin, and I let out a quiet gasp. But then, as quickly as it started, the reality of the situation hit me like a cold wave. I pulled back, breaking the kiss, my breath coming in ragged gasps. "We can't do this," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Isabel looked at me, her eyes dark with desire. But there was something else there too. Uncertainty. Maybe even guilt. "I know," she said quietly, though she made no move to pull away. For a moment we just stood there, our breaths mingling in the still air, the weight of what we had just done hanging between us. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I could feel the adrenaline coursing through my veins. I didn't know what to say, what to do. We had crossed a line, one that couldn't be uncrossed, and the consequences of that realization settled heavily in my chest. "I don't want to stop," Isabel said finally, her voice soft but resolute. Her words sent a jolt through me, and I found myself torn between the desire I felt and the reality of what we were risking. My mind was a whirlwind of conflicting emotions, desire, guilt, confusion. But when I looked into her eyes, I knew I couldn't walk away from this. Not now. I reached for her again, pulling her into another kiss, this one more urgent, more desperate. She responded in kind, her body pressing against mine as we gave in to the pull between us. My hands roamed over her, feeling the heat of her skin beneath her clothes, and I felt a thrill of excitement mixed with the fear of being caught. We stumbled back toward the desk, knocking over papers and pens in our haste, but neither of us cared. The only thing that mattered was the fire between us, the way her touch sent waves of pleasure through me, the way our bodies fit together perfectly. Time seemed to blur as we lost ourselves in each other, the tension that had been building for weeks finally finding its release. Every touch, every kiss felt electric, as if we had been waiting for this moment all along. But even as we indulged in the passion, a part of me couldn't shake the knowledge that we were walking a dangerous line. What would happen when the night was over? When the office lights came back on, and we were faced with the reality of what we had done? Finally, after what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, we broke apart, both of us breathing hard, our clothes disheveled and our bodies flushed. I could see the same mix of emotions on her face that I was feeling: desire, confusion, guilt. "We shouldn't have done that," I said, though even as the words left my mouth, I wasn't sure I believed them. Isabel looked at me, her eyes softening. "Maybe not," she agreed, her voice quiet. "But it's done now." We stood there for a moment, neither of us sure what to say next. The silence between us was heavy with everything we hadn't said: the consequences, the risks, the feelings we had been trying so hard to ignore. "I don't know what this means," I admitted finally, my voice barely audible. "Neither do I," Isabel replied, her eyes searching mine. "But we'll figure it out. Together." Her words hung in the air, and I felt a strange sense of comfort in them, even though I knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. We had crossed a line that couldn't be undone, and now we had to face the consequences of that choice. But for tonight, In the quiet of the office after hours, all that mattered was the connection between us, the undeniable pull that had brought us here. And though the future was uncertain, I couldn't help but feel that somehow we would find a way through it. The silence between us lingered, filled with the unspoken weight of what we had just done. The dim office lighting cast long shadows on the walls, making everything feel surreal, like we were suspended in a moment outside of time. Isabel's breath was still heavy, her hand resting lightly on my chest, and I could feel her heartbeat in sync with mine. I tried to gather my thoughts, but my mind was a mess of conflicting emotions. I wanted to speak, to say something that would make sense of the situation, but words failed me. Isabel, too, seemed lost in her own thoughts, her gaze distant as she stared at the scattered papers on the desk. Finally, she broke the silence, her voice soft and almost hesitant. "This can't happen again." Her words were barely a whisper, but the impact of them hit me hard, like a door slamming shut on whatever it was that had just unfolded between us. I nodded, though I wasn't sure I believed it. "Yeah, I know." But the truth was, I didn't know. I didn't know how I was supposed to come into this office tomorrow, see her across the conference table and act like nothing had happened. Like I hadn't felt the way her lips moved against mine, or how her touch had ignited something inside me that I hadn't felt in years. How was I supposed to pretend that those feelings weren't real, that they didn't still linger in the air between us? Isabel stepped back, straightening her blouse, her fingers trembling slightly as she smoothed down the fabric. She was trying to regain control, to put the walls back up that had crumbled so easily just moments before. I watched her, feeling a pang of guilt mixed with the remnants of desire. I wanted to reach out, to touch her again, to reassure her that this didn't have to be the end of whatever this was. But I knew better. "We've crossed a line," she said, her voice firmer now, more like the Isabel I knew. "A line that we can't cross again." I swallowed hard, my throat tight. "I understand." She nodded, though I could see the conflict still in her eyes. "Good, because I can't afford any distractions right now. Neither can you." Her words were measured, controlled, but the undercurrent of emotion was unmistakable. There was a long pause as we stood there, both of us too afraid to move, too afraid to say anything that might make the situation worse. The weight of the night hung over us like a heavy fog, thick and impenetrable. "I should go," she said abruptly, breaking the silence once again. She turned away, reaching for her bag and jacket that she had draped over the back of the chair earlier in the evening. I watched her, feeling a strange mix of relief and regret. As she made her way toward the door, she paused, her hand resting on the handle. She didn't turn to look at me, but I could hear the tremor in her voice when she spoke. "Tomorrow, we'll act like this never happened." I opened my mouth to respond, but no words came out. I wasn't sure if I could act like it never happened, but I nodded anyway, even though she couldn't see me. Without another word, Isabel slipped out of the office, the door closing softly behind her, leaving me standing alone in the dim light. The room felt impossibly empty now, like all the air had been sucked out, and I was left gasping for something to hold on to. I sank into my chair, staring at the desk in front of me. The papers, the laptop, the half-empty cup of coffee. Everything looked the same as it had just hours before, but I knew nothing would ever be the same again. The connection between us, the desire that had simmered for so long, had finally boiled over, and now we had to deal with the fallout. I leaned back in my chair, running a hand through my hair as I tried to calm the storm of emotions swirling inside me. Guilt, desire, confusion. It all blended together in a way that left me feeling disoriented, like I was spinning in circles with no way out. I knew Isabel was right. This couldn't happen again. We had crossed a line that shouldn't have been crossed, and going any further would only complicate things more. But even as I told myself that, I couldn't stop thinking about her. The way her lips had felt against mine, the way her body had pressed against me. the intensity of the moment that had consumed us both. I should have felt guilty. I should have been thinking about the professional consequences, the ethical boundaries we had shattered. But all I could think about was her. The next morning, the office buzzed with the usual activity. Phones rang, emails pinged, and the sound of hurried footsteps filled the hallway. Everything seemed normal, routine, except for the knot in my stomach as I waited for her to arrive. I kept my head down, focusing on the reports I was supposed to be reviewing, but every minute that passed felt like an eternity. I couldn't stop glancing at the door, waiting for her to walk in, dreading and anticipating it in equal measure. Finally, she arrived. Isabel walked into the office with the same confidence she always had, her heels clicking sharply on the floor as she made her way to her desk. She didn't look at me, didn't acknowledge me, and for a moment, I wondered if last night had been a dream, some strange, vivid fantasy I'd concocted in the quiet hours of the night. But then our eyes met, just for a split second, and I knew. The tension was still there, just below the surface, simmering. We both felt it, but we were both determined to pretend it didn't exist. The day dragged on, the hours filled with meetings and phone calls, but the weight of what had happened hung over me like a dark cloud. Every time Isabel spoke to me, it was clipped, professional, as if she was trying to maintain as much distance as possible. But I could see the flicker of something in her eyes every time we locked gazes, a flash of the desire we had shared, quickly hidden behind the mask of professionalism. By the time the day ended, I was exhausted, not from the work, but from the constant effort of pretending everything was normal. I packed up my things, ready to leave, when Isabel's voice stopped me in my tracks. "Wait," she said softly, her tone much different from the detached one she had used all day. I turned to face her, my heart pounding in my chest. Isabel stood by her desk, her expression unreadable. For a moment, we just stared at each other, the air between us thick with everything we weren't saying. She hesitated, her usual confidence wavering. "I need to talk to you." I nodded, waiting, unsure of what to expect. She glanced around, checking to make sure the office was empty, then walked toward me, her steps slow and deliberate. "I thought I could just forget about last night," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "But I can't, and I don't know what to do about it." Her admission hit me like a punch to the gut. I had been trying to bury the feelings, to push them down and move on, but hearing her say it made it impossible to ignore. "I've been thinking about it too," I confessed, my voice quiet. "I know we shouldn't have, but I can't stop thinking about it." She took a step closer, her eyes searching mine. "I thought I could control this. I thought I could be professional, but I can't stop wanting you." Her words sent a jolt through me, and I felt the pull between us growing stronger, undeniable. I wanted her too, more than I could admit, even to myself. "Isabel," I started, my voice trembling with the weight of everything I was feeling. But before I could finish, she closed the distance between us, her lips crashing against mine in a kiss that was filled with all the pent-up desire, all the emotion we had been trying to suppress. It was reckless, dangerous, but in that moment, I didn't care. We were crossing the line again, and this time, there was no turning back. The kiss consumed us, all the barriers we had carefully constructed over the course of the day crumbling in an instant. There was no room for rational thought, no space for considering the consequences. The only thing that mattered was the heat between us, the undeniable connection that had been building for weeks, finally exploding in a moment of raw, unfiltered passion. Isabel's hands found their way into my hair, pulling me closer, as if she couldn't bear the distance between us. My hands slid down her back, feeling the warmth of her skin through the fabric of her blouse, and I felt a shiver run down my spine. Everything about her felt electric, as if I was standing too close to a fire, but instead of pulling away, I leaned in, letting myself burn. The office was eerily silent around us, the faint hum of the fluorescent lights overhead the only sound as we lost ourselves in each other. Her breath was hot against my neck as her lips traveled lower, sending sparks of desire through me. I pulled her closer, my mind a blur of need and want, completely surrendering to the moment. It was reckless. We both knew it. But neither of us stopped. We stumbled back toward her desk, knocking over papers and pens in our haste. The world outside the office ceased to exist. There was no job, no hierarchy, no rules. Just the two of us, caught in something we couldn't control, something that felt inevitable. Isabel's hands moved with purpose, deftly unbuttoning my shirt as I kissed her deeply, our movements becoming more frantic, more desperate. My fingers trembled as I undid the buttons of her blouse, exposing the soft skin underneath. Her breathing quickened, her body arching into mine as we crossed yet another line, one we both knew couldn't be undone. I wanted her more than I had ever wanted anything, and in that moment, I wasn't thinking about the consequences. I wasn't thinking about how this would change everything between us. All I could think about was the way her body felt against mine, the way her touch sent electricity coursing through me. But as we stood there, tangled in each other, the intensity of the moment suddenly gave way to a flood of emotions: guilt, fear, confusion. The reality of what we were doing began to settle in, even as our bodies moved together, driven by desire. I could feel the weight of it, pressing down on me, threatening to suffocate the exhilaration that had filled me just moments ago. This wasn't right. We both knew it. But we were too far gone to stop. We gave in to the pull between us, our movements feverish and unrestrained. The tension that had simmered for so long finally reached its boiling point, and there was no turning back. Every touch, every kiss was filled with an urgency that bordered on desperation, as if we both knew this moment couldn't last. But as we reached the height of our passion, the weight of what we were doing crashed over me like a tidal wave. It was overwhelming, suffocating, and suddenly, I wasn't lost in the heat of the moment anymore. I was drowning in the consequences of what we had done, and I could feel the same realization settling over Isabel. We froze, our bodies still entangled. But the fire that had fueled us just moments ago had been extinguished by the harsh light of reality. I pulled away first, my breath ragged as I tried to steady myself, tried to make sense of the storm of emotions swirling inside me. Isabel stood there, her blouse half open, her face flushed with desire and confusion. Her eyes searched mine, and I could see the same guilt and regret reflected back at me. The silence between us was deafening, and for the first time since this had started, I didn't know what to say. She swallowed hard, her voice barely above a whisper when she finally spoke. "We can't do this again." I nodded, my throat tight with emotion. "I know." But knowing didn't make it any easier. The weight of what we had done hung heavy between us, thick and oppressive. I could see the conflict in her eyes, the same battle that was raging inside me. Part of me wanted to reach out, to pull her close again, to tell her that we could make this work, that we could find a way to deal with the consequences later. But I knew that was a lie. This wasn't something we could fix. We had crossed a line, one that couldn't be uncrossed, and now we had to live with that. Isabel took a step back, her fingers trembling as she adjusted her blouse, her movements stiff and mechanical. "We have to stop this," she said, her voice more steady now, though I could hear the strain beneath it. "Before we make things worse." I nodded again, though the words felt hollow in my mouth. It was already worse. There was no undoing what had happened, no pretending that this hadn't changed everything. "I don't know how to move forward from this," I admitted quietly, my voice breaking. Isabel looked at me, her eyes softening for a moment. "Neither do I," she said, her voice laced with regret. "But we don't have a choice." She was right. There was no path forward that didn't involve consequences, both personal and professional. What we had done couldn't stay hidden forever. The lines had blurred, and now there was no clear way back. We stood there in silence for what felt like an eternity, the weight of the moment pressing down on us both. Finally, Isabel took a deep breath and straightened her posture, the familiar mask of professionalism slipping back into place. "We'll keep this between us," she said, her voice firm, "but it can't happen again. We have to put it behind us." I nodded, though the words felt like ash in my mouth. "Yeah. Okay." But as I watched her turn and walk away, the space between us widening with every step, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been irreparably broken, not just between us, but within me. I stood there for a long time after she left, the quiet of the office pressing in around me. The same office where everything had changed, where a line had been crossed that could never be undone. The guilt gnawed at me, but beneath it was something else, something darker, something I didn't want to acknowledge. I wanted her. I still wanted her, and that more than anything was the problem. When I finally left the office that night, the world outside felt colder, more distant. The drive home was a blur, my thoughts consumed by the whirlwind of emotions I had no idea how to process. I didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but I knew one thing for certain: things would never be the same again.